I'm very pleased to welcome here Allan Third, member of the Blockchain Research Group in the Knowledge Media Group at the UK's Open University. It's a whole mouthful, but very pleased to have you here. Blockchains and their potential for higher education. Please, the floor is yours.
Hi. So I'm a bit intimidated now because no one has been shut up by the piano yet. It's slightly scary. Bye. Okay. I'm probably going to be the first, or I will finish in 10 minutes when I've got a longer slot than that. One of the two is going to happen. For those of you who don't know, the Open University is the UK's largest higher education institution in terms of students. We have about, I think, 170,000 students, the last statistics I heard. None of them on campus, so we have a beautiful campus with no students. It's amazing. We're entirely distance learning and online education. And we are very concerned with lifelong learning and access to higher education for disadvantaged groups. The Knowledge Media Institute is an R&D lab for the OU, which focuses on various technological solutions to help in that mission. We do an awful lot with the semantic web, and the last couple of years we've been doing quite a bit with blockchains. So that's kind of the context in which I'm talking. So today I'm just going to effectively, I suppose, talk through certain scenarios that we've come up with for where we think blockchains offer opportunities for higher education, and some, assuming the videos work, some mini demos of pilot solutions we've developed for this. So I'm going to talk firstly why blockchains would be useful. A lot of people can get carried away and say, well, this is a very exciting new technology. We have to use blockchains for it. Well, it's going to make everything amazing. And it doesn't. They're very often just not appropriate. But there are certain things that they are appropriate for, and when they're appropriate, they're incredibly useful. So the areas I'll talk about will be certification, employment and recruitment, things like badging, e-portfolios, and reputation. And then the possibilities these lead to for disintermediation of higher education. And then a little bit at the end about interoperability, because I think, again, particularly amongst hardcore blockchain enthusiasts, that seems to get overlooked as a question. So to start with, what do blockchains offer? So education, or higher education, has a number of relevant parties. So obviously there's the students, there are issuing institutions, there are employers, there are teachers, there are people who validate qualifications in terms of their content and also in terms of their authenticity. Those are separate tasks. And there are ways in which having central blockchains, central in inverted commas, because it's obviously decentralized, can help each of these parties gain some value in the higher education sphere. So the capabilities of a blockchain that contribute to this. So obviously, and this has been discussed a lot already, and I'm sure will be further, verifiability. When a record is stored on a blockchain, you have the means, provided the blockchain network you're using is large enough, you have the ability to verify that a record was genuinely made when it says it was made, that it was made by the entities who claim to have made it, and that its content has not been tampered with or edited or deleted or corrupted. So you can check that things have not been touched. If that is not a requirement for your blockchain application, then you don't need a blockchain. It is a multi-right database. It allows records to be added by any party who joins the blockchain. It is particularly suitable in contexts when those people who are adding data to a blockchain, adding data to a data store, do not trust each other. There is a potential for fraud. blockchains have the ability to, I won't say eliminate, because that would be getting a bit carried away, but to minimize the possibilities for fraud. If you don't have that requirement for your application, you probably don't need a blockchain. There's also the need that records should interact with each other. So the multiple parties should be interested in the same record. Again, before you will derive any value from using a blockchain or distributed ledger. And in terms, not necessarily with Bitcoin, because the scripting in Bitcoin is quite limited, but with other blockchain platforms such as Ethereum, which support smart contracts where you can actually deploy running code onto the blockchain and you can execute it via the blockchain, it gives you a form of trusted execution. So someone can see the code that is running on the chain, they can see what it does via open source publication, and they can tell that the code that is being run has not been touched and is genuinely an implementation of the source code you can see. So you can trust that if someone says this code produces these outputs, you can trust that that is true. These are the so-called smart contracts. Although I work with some lawyers who strongly object to the use of the word contract for them, but yes. And the final thing which we think a blockchain can provide is asset backing. So people think in terms of cryptocurrencies, but it doesn't necessarily have to be cryptocurrencies. There can be other forms of assets that you put on a blockchain that gain value from the immutability and the trustability. So we think those are features, of these together are features of blockchains that we think are useful for higher education. So in more sort of concrete use cases now, so we've heard a lot about certification, and it's the first thing that comes to mind. It seems there's a large amount of value to be derived from having a distributed, trustable, decentralized form of certification that can be verified without any of the parties involved needing to continue to exist or to continue to be trustworthy. Once someone has put a certificate on the blockchain, it persists regardless, as Natalie said, of whether Learning Machine still exists or whether the institution, whether MIT still exists, although MIT is likely still to exist. As far as I know, the first higher education institution to issue credentials on a blockchain was the University of Nicosia in Cyprus a few years ago. Obviously, we've heard about MIT, we've heard about Learning Machine, which are, of course, are using the same standard, although I see I've messed up the slide and obscured the name Learning Machine, but it's there. Sony have been getting involved in this space too and looking at the potential for putting records on the blockchain, again with the aim of verifying academic achievements. At the Open University, we're very concerned with this, not just because as a university we have costs in backing up our student records and ensuring that those who graduate from us can always rely on us to accredit their certification, but also because as an adult education institution with a strong focus on disadvantaged groups, often our students have a very mixed education history. They have maybe started courses, they haven't completed them for various reasons, they've got bits of education and educational credentials from multiple institutions, which it is very hard to bring together as a record of that person's achievements. And what we like to do is to recognise, when students come to us, we like to recognise their existing achievements, we like to know what they've already done and give them credit for it. So credit transfer is a slightly bigger deal for us than it necessarily is for other universities, and we would like to have the facility to recognise that and be able to trust that when students come to us and say, I did this short module here, I did some evening classes there, that we would like to be able to take that into account when considering their degree. So we're very, very interested in that. So certification is, I think we can all agree, one of the sort of large areas where blockchains can be helpful for higher education. So separate from certification, although related, and I don't think this has been mentioned so much today, but I guess it comes into the human capital agenda discussion, is there are companies interested in the recruitment sphere. Employers, of course, are concerned with the credentials of their employees, and recruitment companies are concerned with providing efficient means of getting people into the workplace because they can use that as a competitive advantage. We have been working with a couple of startups in the United Kingdom. One is called Appy, and another is called GradBase. They're both based in London. Both of these are concerned with packaging up blockchain credentials for employers so that you can have a CV or a resume built on a blockchain-backed platform which will allow employers to verify not just individual certification, but an entire education and employment history of potential employees very quickly. And in doing so, reduce the lead time from advertising a post to getting somebody actually at the desk in job. Currently, I believe in the UK, the current lead time is on average 100 days, which seems a very long time. And a large chunk of that is taken up with verifying that people have the credentials they say they do. So on the commercial side, there's room in the recruitment sphere to improve that dramatically via a trustable automatic solution. Slightly less away from the formal certification sphere, we have also been looking at recognition of informal learning, or I don't know if part-time is the right word, but less formal, less, not necessarily, as of ongoing education, I suppose, in the process. So, of course, we've been looking at badging. And more generally, we think badges are a token of reputation in terms of educational achievement, and we've been looking at more generally at that, where reputation can be modelled and represented using blockchains. And we have also, I don't have a great deal on this, but a little bit about e-portfolios, because we have also done some work with directly certifying not just students' achievements, but students' work directly. Again, using the blockchains as a backing store. So in terms of badging, so the Open University has the OpenLearn platform, which is an entirely free platform of open educational resources people can use to learn. You can study courses on OpenLearn, and you will be rewarded with open badges following the 1.1 specification of open badges, which a lot of other online education providers, of course, also provide. That's the benefit of the standard. So we have implemented the representation of badges on the blockchain in such a way that it links to the original course materials and can be verified by anyone who wishes to check. All you need is some details provided by the student, and you can check whether that badge was in fact accurately issued to that student by us in the first place. We have a pilot with this with, I think it's around 1,000 badges from the OpenLearn platform being published on the Ethereum public blockchain. Each of the elements of the badge are implemented as a separate smart contract with links between each other. And it's possible from the system to generate a standard classical open badge with the details baked into an image to be transferred to others or added to a backpack, but still with a reference back to where on our blockchain implementation the badge has been stored.
Allocating some tokens.
Sorry?
So I'm going to pretend Michelle is giving 4 organisation tokens.
Oh, the video has started. This is my office mate Michelle talking. I thought on my laptop I have to press play. Ignore what Michelle is saying. So we're taking the badging idea a bit further. Sorry about that.
So in order to get one of the badges,
So credentials and even at the level of badges are often awarded for specific measurable things in education, usually things that you can assess using traditional assessment criteria. But what about other things that are harder to assess? If you have students working on team projects, how do you reward people for their contribution for team projects? How do you recognise the learning of soft skills? This isn't just true in higher education or childhood education for that matter, but also particularly in professional development spheres where you want things like teamwork and collaboration to be something that people improve at, something that you want to recognise and reward people for. So one way we thought of you could do this is by creating a secondary token on the Ethereum platform, so something that is backed by the platform but is not a cryptocurrency but can be transferred between accounts, is you could provide people with a stock of reputation tokens that they could assign to their peers to be used to recognise when someone has successfully demonstrated certain soft skills in actual practice in the workplace or in the classroom, in group work. So that you can say, what are the fields we've entered here? We've got organisation, collaboration, communication, ethics, problem solving and engagement. We've just picked some examples of sort of soft areas you might want to recognise people for that is very difficult to access using traditional assessment. And effectively have a peer-sourced form of this. So that if someone is assigned 4 tokens for reputation, you can, of course, because it's on the blockchain, you can verify that that is in fact relevant. You can identify networks where friends might, all give each other nice high ratings you can, keep an eye on, make sure people are being honest about these things. So we've built a system that allows different accounts on the chain to be rewarded with tokens for the soft skills. And we think these types of approaches to assessment in more difficult areas might prove useful, and we don't think there are opportunities to handle this in quite such a nice way without using blockchains. Going further, one of the big potentials, my boss talks about this all the time, is the potential for disintermediation of higher education, to separate out the different tasks, roles, contributions that go into providing higher education, and allowing them to work together nicely and allowing the appropriate credit to be assigned. Now, you could read these sort of scenarios that I'm going to talk about in a financial sense, that you want people to be paid for their work, but also, even if you stick with the traditional funding models, you want people to be able to be credited for their work, to be recognised for what they do. You want the students to be able to be in control of their records, which, again, a number of people have spoken about today, and I think it's very, very important. So you can separate out the accreditation of achievements. You can separate out the work that students do. If students produce digital formatted work towards a qualification, you can either store that directly on the blockchain if it's small, or store a hash identifying it and verifying it on the blockchain if it's large, to make a verifiable e-portfolio available, which then separates out the recognition of achievement, because if anyone can look at your portfolio and they can pull out the parts of it that are interesting to them, to what they are looking at you for, and they can assess them separately, independently of what you may have originally been assessed for that work in its original context when you provided it. There are, of course, privacy concerns with this. We've developed a pilot in which, yes, you can store portfolio items on the blockchain, but you can selectively reveal those to individual audiences. So you don't have to reveal your entire portfolio as a matter of public. But if you want someone to look at your work, you can control who can access it in a time-limited way. What other aspects of this? You can separate out courses from the institutions which accredit them, from the teachers who teach them, from the employers who assess them, from the students who take them. The course materials contributing to a course are also a separate resource. Currently, these are bundled together in the traditional higher education model. A course is synonymous with the people teaching it, the materials in it, the institution accrediting it. Everything is tied together, but these don't have to be. They could be separated out, which might give some extra flexibility. We think particularly in the lifelong learning sphere, where you have people gaining skills from a number of different scenarios and different sources. The next slide, I'm not going to say whether I think this is a good idea or not. It is a possibility from this, is the concept of something like the Uber University, where people can provide parts that are needed for an education, and the student themselves has control over how those are knit together into a whole educational experience. Which, yes, in the Uber, so this is in the financial sense, you can, using blockchains, ensure that credit is just like financial credit is distributed appropriately to each of the people who have contributed to this. Stepping back to a more traditional model, like I say, if you view this not in terms of finances, but in terms of reputation, currently the people who produce our course materials at the Open University do not particularly get credited by the students. They're not really, their name is somewhere in a credits list, but they're not really in front of the students. But if the student can recognise course materials independently from their tutor or from the course, then there's a bit more opportunity for recognition there. Michelle is going to start talking again soon, but hopefully it's not too loud. But we again, a little demo we set up where you can book a tutorial slot, and after that is over, you're able to assign the same kind of reputation tokens we were talking about earlier to individual elements that went into you having that learning experience, so that we can allow students to rate in a trustable way the things that they worked for them about a certain experience and didn't work for others, and assign credit appropriately. This is just a demo, and yes, people are going to tell me they can see various ways in which this can be abused, and of course it can, but having the potential there gives you the chance to explore that space and see what you can best achieve with it. Finally, just a little bit about interoperability. So, as I say, we at KMI are very heavily into the semantic web, and the web is the largest source of data about everything that we have in the world. And particularly, I mean, if you read some of the Ethereum blogs and things, they'll say, oh, we are Web 3.0, we are going to replace the web, no one will need the web anymore. And we're going to need the web, and we're going to need the data that is there and the things that are accessible there, and we need to interoperate with it. In the spirit of openness and tying things together, I mean, one of my main focuses on semantics and linked data. So we are working so in two ways. So in the semantics side and on the interoperability side, we have partners across the UK and in a number of other countries in different higher education institutions, with currently separate for test reasons because of legal frameworks, but separate private blockchains in which we can experiment, not as individual institutions developing solutions on the blockchain, but as networks. The value in using this sort of situation is not because the Open University can issue credentials on the blockchain, it is because multiple universities can issue credentials on the blockchain, or badges, or reputation, or anything. So we have collaborators in various places with whom we're working on experiments in that. And on the technical side, I have been working with my colleagues on semantic data in general going on the blockchain. We have linked data interfaces on the blockchain so that you can have linked open data can be published, in this case on Ethereum. And we're working on how to extend the standards for linked data to provide for trustworthiness of data results, which we think in the education sphere has the possibility. So open badges, for example, are linked data. Not many people necessarily know that, but open badges 1.1 upwards is a linked data standard. We can tie what records we have for students, which we're backing on a blockchain, with data sources elsewhere in what we currently have as the most effective standard for data interoperability, which is the linked open data standard. So we think this has got an awful lot of potential and a lot of scope for ensuring a common platform in which the web and blockchain situations, applications work together nicely in a standards compliant way. I've fuzzed that out because the identifiers there relate to actual student data. So, and this is not a public-facing website yet for that reason, but because we haven't anonymized it. But, so to summarize, the various benefits from the blockchain, and I know a lot of other people will be talking and have spoken about some of these areas in more detail, but there is a form of inbuilt identity management, and there are various ways to manage self-sovereign identity. There are various problems associated with that, but the facility is there for some form of trustable identity. There is a possibility for students themselves to own and control their data, which again has been mentioned a few times. There is more openness and transparency, and a reduced risk of fraud. My boss has a hobby. He collects stories of people who have fabricated their academic credentials and then been found out in an embarrassing way. He seems to take some kind of pleasure in this. On the practical side, of course, we're lowering of process costs and having a common infrastructure that lowers the barrier to education and enables smaller institutions perhaps to compete in ways they wouldn't otherwise be able to afford to. And yes, I think there's a possible for encouraging collaboration and interoperability and disaggregation and disintermediation in higher education, which we think can have benefits for students, though of course we are well aware. I am glossing over things that are problems here, but we are aware of them and they're important to be talked about, particularly with privacy and the right to be forgotten, and so on. That's the end of my talk, so thank you.